The Israelis came 1,500 miles, scored a direct hit on the PLO headquarters based in Tunis, and only just missed the PLO leader, Yasser Arafat. It was a revenge raid by the Israelis following last week's attack on an Israeli yacht in Cyprus. 3 people were killed by a PLO unit from Tunisia.
As a matter of principle, it's our view that it is legitimate self-defense to respond appropriately to acts of terrorism.
As terrorist warfare continued, a plane load of Israelis arrived at Heathrow Airport. The passengers had no idea that among them was their foreign minister on a top-secret mission.
I came disguised in a wig and glasses. When I got to passport control, he asked, "On holiday or business?" I didn't know what to say. Finally, I said, "On business."
Shimon Peres wanted to extend the peace with Egypt to Jordan and the Palestinians. That same day, King Hussein of Jordan piloted his own plane to London. He had been invited to meet Peres by a mutual friend.
I had many questions in my mind about it, but he didn't give me any detail. He just told me that he had contacts with Peres, which were a beginning of talk about what could be done.
The British lawyer, Lord Mishkan, had provided the meeting place and given his staff the day off.
King Hussein said, "We'll wash up the dishes." I immediately agreed. But Mrs. Mishkan said no. She wouldn't dream of letting a king do her dishes.
They now settled down to work out how to begin the process of negotiations. Israel still didn't want to negotiate with the PLO, which it saw as a terrorist organization dedicated to its destruction.
We discussed the impasse. The problem was how to get the Palestinians to the negotiating table against Israeli opposition, against American opposition.
Hussein said, if you were clever, you would recognize the PLO. That would show everyone the truth. The PLO is just unwilling to negotiate.
Israel was willing to negotiate only with those Palestinians recognizing the right of Israel to exist.
Peace talks with Palestinians who accepted Israel's right to exist would exclude the PLO.
I had a bit of time to think about it, and at the same time to see if I had any last thoughts before such a monumental decision was taken. And then I decided, all right, fine, we'll go.
The idea they came up with was a peace conference that excluded the PLO. Back in Israel, Shimon Peres faced a difficult meeting with his prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir. Peres's moderate Labor Party was part of a coalition that straddled the divide of Israeli politics. Shamir, a hardliner, opposed the conference. He wanted to negotiate separately with each Arab country and didn't want to deal with the Palestinians at all.
He said he'd agreed with King Hussein to hold an international conference. An international conference? For me, that would be as bad as a pig in the temple.
Shamir mistrusted Peres. He feared Israel would be outnumbered by the Arab states at the conference. Peres assured him the conference would quickly adjourn into individual talks with each Arab state, and the PLO would not be invited.
I said, leave the text. I'll read it later.
I said, no, I can't leave the agreement. Your staff might leak it and spoil my plan. It has to look like it comes from the Americans.
Peres and King Hussein agreed that only America had the clout to get everyone to attend. So Peres then contacted the American Secretary of State.
What he proposed now was that I take this on board as my proposal and then present it to the Israeli government.
I saw danger, even in a visit from Schultz. I decided to send an envoy to America. I sent our former ambassador.
And I told Schultz very plainly that the subject of the international conference was a subject of divided opinion in Israel, mainly between the Likud and the Labour Party, and that if he were to come to Israel to provide his support for the agreement that Peres had arrived at, he would be entering Israeli domestic politics. And he said, I'm not going to make the trip.
Trying to keep the process going, Peres persuaded Shamir to meet with Jordan's King Hussein. The king invited Shamir to his house in London. Hussein explained that he could represent the Palestinians.
The king was very critical of the Americans. He said, they made promises they didn't honor. They promised Jordan would get back the land Israel had occupied. But this hasn't happened. I thought to myself, I'm responsible for that.
He was very blunt. There was not very much room for putting any of the ideas or hopes or aspirations that I had in mind.
I refused point blank to discuss an international conference.
So there wasn't much that we could really speak about or agree about.
The next morning, I flew back to Jerusalem. None of my colleagues knew where I'd been or who I'd been meeting.
We got a report from that meeting from Shamir, who was very happy about it. The king was so courteous. He served a kosher meal. He was listened to me, and he was warm and so on. We got a report from King Hussein, who said, well, we had the meeting and it was terribly discouraging because it's obvious to me that the Prime Minister is not willing to give any ground at all.
Shamir rejected Hussein as a representative of the Palestinians and repeated his unwillingness to negotiate with the PLO. Meanwhile, the Palestinians, squeezed into the Gaza Strip for the last 20 years under Israeli rule, grew increasingly frustrated. On December 8, 1987, an Israeli truck accidentally hit a car carrying 4 Palestinian laborers.
All the people in the car were killed. We thought this was no accident. It was done on purpose by the Israelis.
Angry crowds soon gathered. An 18-year-old Palestinian threw a stone at some Israeli soldiers. When they fired back, the boy was killed. The Israeli security forces then stepped up their presence in the occupied territories. A group of young activists seized the opportunity to prepare a leaflet calling for an uprising.
Early in the morning, our leaflet was ready. We had cars standing by. We asked children and pregnant women to help. They could slip past the Israelis at the checkpoint.
Palestinian workers were urged to go on strike. Shopkeepers were told to shut their businesses. The Intifada had begun. Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership, still in exile in Tunis, learned about the Intifada from a newscast.
It is the resistance and the revolution of all our children, or our women, or our people, or our men. This is the accumulation of the revolution.
In fact, we didn't know who issued the leaflets. We were worried. We wanted to know who was behind all this.
From the other end of the Mediterranean, the PLO could provide little day-to-day guidance to the Intifada organizers. The demonstrations, which began in Gaza, now spread to East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Palestinian flag, an illegal symbol under Israeli rule, began to appear all over the occupied territories.
Now, even the bourgeoisie, everyone joined the Intifada. This really encouraged us.
To keep the Intifada going, one young activist sought guidance from Faisal Husseini, the head of one of the oldest Palestinian families. Husseini had spent the last few years in and out of Israeli jails for his political activities.
I told him the Intifada must not change tactics. Don't use weapons or guns. Don't give the Israelis an excuse to use their technology. We want to tie down as many soldiers as we can.
The strategy of minimum force caught the Israelis off guard.
We are facing now a new form of warfare against us. It means the attempt to destroy our existence by violent demonstrations.
The Israelis tried to break the morale of the protesters with mass arrests. They blew up the homes of convicted terrorists.
It is not a nice picture to witness blowing a house. I forced myself to be with the soldiers, understanding that they feel as I feel.
When the Israeli cabinet met, members of the coalition argued about how best to end the Intifada.
Arik Sharon bikesh et rashut hadibur.
Ariel Sharon spoke up. In essence, he said, Mr. Prime Minister, we must order the army to suppress the Intifada. The army will find a way.
Some of the ministers made horrifying suggestions. They suggested, send in the tanks, kill 1,000 and it will collapse. Order will be restored to Israel. We knew if we killed 1,000 it would get worse, and we would be branded war criminals.
The cabinet rejected all of this, but told the defense minister, Yitzhak Rabin, to find a way to end the Intifada.
Rabin stood in front of the soldiers and said, "Gentlemen, don't just stand there. Use your hands, use your clubs, defeat the demonstrators, restore order.
Trying to restore order without shooting the demonstrators, Rabin told his soldiers to club them instead. Scenes like this were broadcast around the world.
They are facing the punishment of the Israelis by their hands, by their stones, not more. Till now, in all over the occupied territories, in every town and village or refugee camp, in all the demonstrations, no one had used a gun or a hand grenade.
Abu Jihad, the PLO's military leader in Tunis, had gained control of the Intifada. He also directed the PLO's terrorist operations. In the middle of the Intifada, Abu Jihad ordered an attack on an Israeli bus carrying people home from work. 3 were killed and 6 wounded.
All were in a state of shock. Those women who had been on the bus and had got away had not escaped the emotional trauma.
A month later, an elite Israeli commando unit landed on a beach in Tunis. Mossad agents guided the commandos to the home of Abu Jihad.
I was woken by the sound of people breaking into the house. Then I heard screams. I was terrified. I heard Abu Jihad moving, running from the desk to the cupboard, where he took his pistol. I saw 3 masked men with machine guns. One of the men opened fire on Abu Jihad. They shot him in his arm and his heart.
Abu Jihad was a leader of the Intifada. Although he was out of the country, he was fighting against us. He was one of their most popular commanders. He fell, just like many others, like people on our side.
But in the intensity of the conflict, both sides were learning something about each other.
For the 40th anniversary of Israel, we had a huge military parade. A few days later, I was in the West Bank. I came across a group of young Palestinians. They knew me from TV. And one of them said, "Yesterday I saw all your fighter aircraft. They're so strong up there. But what can you do against stone throwers down here?" This was our problem, and the young people's power.
You know that if you beat them and shoot them and do whatever you want to them, they won't stop. We train to fight against the other soldiers. And now we fight against the people. It's difficult.
Increasingly, Israelis asked themselves whether they could rule more than 1 million Palestinians in the occupied territories forever.
We can't solve this problem. It's the government, it's the politician have to solve that problem, not we are.
The Intifada vented Palestinian frustration but it also demonstrated that neither terrorism nor street revolt would solve their political problems. In Tunis, one PLO leader discussed what to do next with a colleague.
We sat there alone. I said, I want to talk about something I've never mentioned before. Can I raise a taboo subject? He said, be my guest.
The PLO had been created to reclaim all of Israel for the Palestinians. Now Abu Mazen suggested that they be realistic, that the only way to get back Gaza and the West Bank was to accept what they rejected 40 years ago, the partition of Palestine.
I asked him, should we consider recognizing Israel? He said yes.
Yasser Arafat was eventually convinced that the PLO would have to compromise. But the other PLO leaders were harder to persuade. Like Sadat, the PLO preferred to negotiate through the Americans. But the Americans laid down a condition. Yasser Arafat, the world's most famous guerrilla leader, would have to renounce terrorism.
He's got to get up in front of a television camera or in some public way and say, for everybody to see him saying it out of his own mouth, these things.
The UN General Assembly gathered in Geneva for a special session to hear Arafat. But not all the factions of the PLO were willing to negotiate.
We did not accept the decision to recognize Israel. We would accept no further compromise.
Arafat's UN speech would be a difficult balancing act.
I hereby once more declare that I condemn terrorism in all its forms.
That was for the Americans. And in a pattern that was to characterize the whole speech, the next phrase was for the PLO radicals.
And at the same time, salute those sitting before me in this hall who, in the days when they fought to free their countries from the yoke of colonialism, were accused of terrorism.
He concluded his speech convinced he had pleased everyone.
I reviewed it with President Reagan, who was following this closely. And I said, well, Mr. President, in one part of his statement, he said, unk, unk, unk. And the other part of his statement, he said, kul, kul, kul. But nowhere did he say uncle. So, no, it's not satisfactory.
Word soon came that the Americans had rejected the balancing act. Arafat's closest advisors implored him to say exactly what Shultz demanded.
I saw that Arafat had a dilemma, whether to say it or not. Should he sit tight, or should he try again?
The next morning, Arafat called a press conference.
I repeat for the record that we totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism.
I view this development as one more step toward the beginning of direct negotiations between the parties, which alone can lead to such a peace.
But Israel's prime minister was unimpressed.
Shamir made a gesture. It meant, this isn't important. Let's not waste time analyzing what Arafat said.
We cannot trust them. They are criminals, they are liars, they are enemies of our people.
Shamir's view of Arafat was reinforced 18 months later. On On August 2, 1990, Iraq's Saddam Hussein sent his army into Kuwait. He boasted that in a war, Israel would end up in flames. Saddam's only support came from Libya, Sudan, and the PLO.
You know, the war will not be only in Baghdad. This war, if it starts, it will be in the whole area. For this, it will be a real catastrophe.
Israel prepared for an attack. As President Bush set out to build a coalition to force Saddam out of Kuwait, he traveled to Damascus to bring Syria into the fold. But President Assad, a firm Arab nationalist, was not easy to convince.
President Assad made very clear to me that he blamed Israel for everything. I'm not sure he blamed him for Iraq going into Kuwait, but he got almost everything. Everything was all about Israel. I made clear to him that we didn't want to link any Middle East peace process talks to whipping Saddam Hussein. But I made clear to him also that we would be involved in trying to be a catalyst for peace for Arabs and Israelis.
As the war started, Saddam ordered an attack on Israel with Scud missiles. Saddam hoped that by attacking Israel, he would get the support of other Arab countries. If Israel retaliated, he might be able to undermine the coalition against him. Iraq's missiles were aimed indiscriminately at Israel's largest cities. The repeated attacks over many nights were nerve-wracking. The Israeli press reported that Palestinians celebrated as the missiles flew over the West Bank on the way to Tel Aviv. Chemical traces in one of the missiles even raised the possibility of a deadly chemical attack.
We would like to see that threat removed, and we will take the actions that are necessary to remove it. I cannot tell you when, I cannot tell you where.
In the end, Israel did not retaliate, but its leaders had learned a hard lesson about their vulnerability. Shamir was also absolutely convinced that, given the opportunity, Israel's Arab enemies would try to destroy it. When the war with Iraq ended, President Bush looked towards the future.
We must do all that we can to close the gap between Israel and the Arab states and between Israelis and Palestinians. There can be no substitute for diplomacy. The time has come to put an end to Arab-Israeli conflict.
The idea was the president, at the height of his prestige, sending the Secretary of State, at the height of his prestige, to the Middle East, and what we basically hoped was that no one would have the nerve to say no to the United States at that moment.
Bush instructed Secretary of State James Baker to persuade the Arabs and Israelis to attend a new peace conference.
Well, the whole idea that we came up with was to give the Arabs what they needed and give the Israelis what they needed.
The bone of contention between Israel and Syria was still the Golan Heights, captured by Israel 20 years earlier. In Damascus, Baker suggested to President Assad that if he came to the conference, Israel might negotiate a withdrawal from the Golan Heights.
We are not negotiating whether the Golan would come back or not, whether part of it would stay under the Israeli control or not. The whole of the Syrian Golan should come back to Syria.
Having gotten nowhere with the Syrians, Baker then tried to tempt Yitzhak Shamir to the peace conference.
I remember saying it's going to be one big meeting that is going to lead then to bilateral negotiations, so that the Israeli government could say, well, this is really not an international conference.
I wouldn't even consider it. It meant negotiating with PLO terrorists.
Baker promised Shamir he would not invite the PLO to the conference. Baker then went to meet Palestinian leaders from the West Bank and Gaza.
We in the PLO leadership opposed them meeting Baker. For us, this meeting was pointless. We thought it would not advance the Palestinian cause.
Some comrades argued that the Americans wanted to create an alternative leadership to replace the PLO.
For 5 nights, Abu Mazen urged the PLO leadership to let Palestinians from the occupied territories meet with Baker. Finally, Yasser Arafat decided he had nothing to lose.
Only it is a meeting, exploratory meeting, nothing more.
If things would proceed positively, then the leadership would take the credit. If things did not work out, then we as individuals would take the blame.
When the Palestinians met Baker in Jerusalem, the PLO insisted that each Palestinian delegate be approved in writing by Arafat.
I said to him, Mr. Secretary, this meeting could not have taken place without the authorization of President Arafat personally. And I took the letter out of my pocket, showed it to him.
I reminded them that the PLO, their organization and their chairman had made a serious mistake in backing Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War.
He sat like this. I pulled my chair around and faced him. We confronted each other just like two fighting cocks.
He was so angry and said, even if you're angry, what can you do? We don't have assets in bank to be frozen by you. We don't have airlines to be grounded by you. We don't have anything in the world that you can threaten us with. So court us, and we're willing to play positively, but as a major player.
The Palestinians refused to repudiate the PLO, and Baker knew this would be unacceptable to Shamir. After 12 weeks of shuttle diplomacy, Baker was stuck.
The only leverage a Secretary of State has in this kind of situation is the ability to blame one party or the other for the collapse of the peace process.
Baker came and told President Assad, it is your position, it is very important. I mean, if you accept, if you feel that this is good for you, and you accept the American initiative, then the whole world will stand by Syria and will put the blame on Israel.
Assad decided to go along.
I'm pleased to report that Syria has agreed to the proposals that we have made, including coming to a peace conference.
Full of confidence, Baker returned to Israel.
There was no way that an Israeli prime minister could appear to be less interested in peace than a Syrian president, especially when the Syrian president accepted coming to this conference on terms that were essentially defined by Israel.
But Shamir put more obstacles in Baker's path. Every time the American team arrived in the Middle East, Israel announced the construction of a new Jewish settlement in the occupied territories, land the Arabs claimed was theirs. Each new Jewish home made Israeli withdrawal more difficult. Furious, Baker went public.
It is easier to obstruct peace than it is to promote it, and that the establishment of these settlements certainly does not help the efforts of those of us who are interested in peace.
The Palestinian reaction was predictable.
I remember Faisal Husseini, at almost every meeting, he would pull out this map.
I brought him maps of the West Bank and Gaza. The first map showed the situation before 1967. The second one showed the situation today, with the settlements all marked in orange.
And I finally said, Faisal, let's talk about what's important here. Let's talk about how we're going to get a negotiation going. Because if we don't, we're going to keep meeting like this, and pretty soon you're going to bring me a map that's totally orange.
He actually told us you have no other alternative. He said, name any way in which you can stop settlements, other than through the peace process.
The local Palestinians were afraid to talk to the Israelis without permission from the PLO in Tunis. A meeting of the Palestine National Council was called.
Our delegation asked Baker, could the refugees return? He said no. Will there be a Palestinian state? He said no. Will the PLO be on the delegation to speak for us? He said no. Chairman Arafat knows that these answers are accurate. They are no, no, and no.
I told the conference, if we don't get on the peace train, it will pass through our station. We will never have another chance.
I said we don't want to be passive victims of history. We want to challenge, to intervene, to intrude, to participate, and to present our own narrative, to speak for ourselves. And this is a forum.
It was a forum Arafat himself had wanted to attend. Reluctantly, he agreed that the team from the occupied territories, not the PLO, would represent the Palestinians. But Shamir had another demand. He asked the Americans to guarantee a loan of $10 billion to help absorb the Soviet immigrants who were now pouring into Israel.
I don't want to interfere in the American interior affair, but I would like to inform everybody that not to forget that they are using these billions in building more illegal settlements on our land.
This was our way to build up our country. What is the Zionist ideal? It is to gather the Jewish people into this small country. So we must set up more and more homes, large and small communities. What are the settlements? They are just communities. No Arabs lived on that land. It is not on their property.
The Americans were unable to stop the Israelis from building settlements. To save the conference, President Bush delayed the loan. American Jewish leaders urged him to reconsider.
I was approached by the leaders of some of the biggest Jewish organizations. A Republican was head of AIPAC, which is a very strong American-Israel political action committee, and he told me that I was making a huge mistake politically.
President Bush wouldn't give in.
For the first time in history, the vision of Israelis sitting with their Arab neighbors to talk peace is a real prospect. Nothing should be done that might interfere with this prospect. And if necessary, I will use my veto power.
We saw the president on television He took a stand against the American Jews. I got really angry. This hurt me, just as it hurt many others.
Bush had faced down Shamir. A few weeks later, Israelis, Arabs, Americans, and Russians assembled in Madrid. For the first time, Palestinians were invited to participate.
Today we have made a major step forward. There is a recognition of the Palestinian national identity. The Palestinians are speaking out for themselves for the first time in history.
The delegates gathered at the Royal Palace.
I will never forget the emotion I felt when, with Gorbachev next to me, we walked into this room in Madrid, and there, across the table, sat Arabs and Israelis. We come to Madrid on a mission of hope.
Everyone expected each Middle East delegation to be led by its foreign minister. But Shamir had a better idea.
I thought, maybe I should go to Madrid myself.
Shamir had devoted his life to fighting for Israel, doing whatever he thought necessary to establish, maintain, and defend the state. As he got up to speak, the conference waited to hear if he was now ready to make peace.
I could go on and recite a litany of facts that demonstrate the extent to which Syria merits the dubious honor of being one of the most oppressive, tyrannical regimes in the world. But this is not what we have come here for.
He attacked Syria bitterly and accused Syria of being on the list of terrorism. And I was very angry.
I looked over and I saw Farouk Shara's face. He just froze. And he called one of his aides over.
So immediately his face changed and he smiled. He said, okay, go back. I will write my speech. I told him, Mr. Minister, it's 15 minutes left. Yesterday we spent 7 hours to prepare your speech. He said, don't worry, I will write headlines.
So I lay aside my prepared speech and said openly, he is the last one to have the right to speak about terrorism because he himself was a wanted terrorist.
I shall just show you, if I may, a photograph, an old photograph of Mr. Shamir. Why was this picture distributed? It was distributed because he was wanted. He helped in the assassination of Count Bernadotte, the UN mediator in Palestine, as I recall, in 1948. He kills peace mediators.
I remember the faces of the Israeli delegation. They were colorless.
One Palestinian delegate then tried to demonstrate that no matter what Shamir thought, he was really negotiating with the PLO.
So I said the only thing that symbolizes Palestinians is the black and white kufiya, which President Arafat wears all the time. So I decided to put it in my shoulder. And the angle of my seat came directly looking Shamir on the eye. It was engineered by God. It was just perfect. And I looked at him and I said to him, I nodded in my head, I said, he shook his head like this. I smiled. Really, he went this way. So I winked to him. And he said, just do this. And then after the session was over, everyone is surrounding me. So I said, why the sensitivities? We are the key to peace, to your peace process as Palestinians. And you must realize the new facts of life.
Amid mutual recriminations, the conference broke into one-to-one talks between Israel and the Arab states.
We and the Syrians moved to opposite sides of this big table. We sat frozen, like robots. The Americans and Russians got out as quickly as they could. They were glad to escape.
It was difficult, half an hour. For me, for example, this will be the first time I sit face to face with the Israelis.
The Syrians wanted us to commit to a withdrawal from the Golan Heights. We didn't want to get into all that.
The withdrawal should not be a question for negotiation. The withdrawal is either there would be a withdrawal, full withdrawal, or there would be no peace.
The moment we would have said that we were ready to withdraw, this might have ended the whole thing, and the Syrians would have avoided the main question for us. That was the character of peace, the end of terrorism, the terrorist organizations with their headquarters in Damascus, and what about Hezbollah and Lebanon under Syrian occupation? All these topics were raised, and every time we tried to break this dogma of the Syrians.
When they finished, the Israelis returned to their hotel, telling the waiting press that all their suggestions to try to build trust had been flatly rejected. There had been no handshakes, no smiles, little personal contact.
I don't want to say that they were a complete failure, because the very fact that we were sitting and talking is in itself already an achievement. But the substance was, as I said, futile.
The Syrians, too, were unimpressed by their meeting.
I would like to express our regret for leaving this city, Madrid, without having tangible results from the bilateral talks that our delegation held yesterday with the Israeli delegation.
Israeli talks with the Palestinian and Jordanian delegation were so positive that they could be crowned with public handshakes afterwards. Both sides here, at least, confident of meeting again soon.
America had finally brought the warring parties to the conference table. But it would take another breakthrough to convert fighters into peacemakers.